She was the only one in the hall who would not look away. That is the first thing I will tell you about Lyra, because it is the thing that unlocked all the rest. I had governed Ardenmoor for 19 years. I had sat the stone chair in the great hall, passed judgment on boundary disputes and broken oaths, sent wolves to war in the northern passes and received their bodies back wrapped in kingdom cloth. I had done all of this without a mate. The bond had never come. My wolf had waited, not urgently, the way young wolves wait, pacing and impatient, but in the way of old things that have learned not to hope too loudly, a stillness at the center of me. A seat left empty at every table. I had stopped thinking about it. And then on the 15th night of the autumn council, the chamber doors opened, and the head of my council, Lord Ardenmoor, who had served my father before he served me, read aloud the charges. Breaking of the Ardenmoor Compact, unlawful seizure of Eastern Pact territory, a falsified record bearing my seal, placed into the archive 3 weeks prior, showing the annexation of Wolfholt lands without the 3-council vote the compact required. 6 witnesses who swore they had seen my personal courier deliver the order. The seal was mine. The handwriting was mine. Even the ink had been drawn from my private cabinet. Ardenmoor read the last line of the charges and set the paper down, and I watched the hall. This is what I remember most about that night, not the words, not the cold of the chain they brought out, not even the sound of my wolf going entirely silent inside me as if a door had been shut. I remember the faces. I had known these people for 2 decades. I had presided at their children's naming ceremonies. I had arbitrated their disputes with patience, settled their debts with fairness, sent wolves to dig their kin out of the flood channels when the northern rivers broke their banks 3 winters past. And now, one by one, I watched their eyes slide away from mine. Not with guilt, not all of them. Some, I think, had simply calculated. The charge was too formal, too documented, the witnesses too many. To stand beside me was to risk being wrong, and no lord of a mid-kingdom pack could afford to be wrong in a council chamber in front of 14 peers. So they looked away. Every one of them. Except, and here is where I must be precise, because this is the hinge on which everything else turned, except the woman at the back of the hall. I did not know her. She was small, unhurried-looking, wearing the traveling cloak of an archive healer, dark wool gone soft at the elbows, a kit bag strapped across one shoulder, the kind of person you would look past in a corridor without even deciding not to see her. She was standing at the very back near the door, and she should not have been there at all. The council session was closed to civilians. I would learn later that she had come into the hall with the compact archive crate that 2 young clerks had delivered at Morthise's request. She had been walking with them, and when the clerks left, she had simply stayed, and no one had thought to check whether she should go. I do not know how long she had been there before I saw her. But when I scanned that row of turning faces and found hers the only one still level, still watchful, still directed at me, my wolf, which had gone utterly silent, made the smallest sound. Not a surge, not a howl, something quieter than that. Like a door ajar. They put the chain on me in the hall. It was ceremonial, Ardenmoor's judgment chain, iron links forged 3 centuries prior, brought out only for the holding of a king during an active council investigation. They did not drag me. Lord Morthise was careful about that. He came forward himself, and I stood still, and he placed the chain around my wrists with his own hands, and his face was absolutely unreadable, and I thought, "You planned this." I thought it clearly and without fire, because the fire had gone out of me the moment I heard the words. I was in the part of crisis that comes after the first shock, the cold, clear part where you see everything very precisely and feel very little. I was held in the Eastern Keep. Not the cells. I was still the Alpha King until the investigation concluded, and Morthise was a man who understood the difference between a king held pending investigation and a criminal imprisoned. I had my own chambers, my own fire, my own access to a small courtyard where I could walk in the mornings. I had 3 meals daily, and whatever books I asked for. What I did not have was my wolf, who had not spoken in 4 days, the silence deeper than sleep, deeper than grief, a silence like the one that comes before a long winter and means the earth is making up its mind. And I did not have my counsel, who were forbidden to speak with me during the investigation. And I did not have a single person in Ardenmoor who had looked me in the face since the night of the chains. On the 5th morning, I heard a sound from below. The eastern keep sits above the archive undercroft. The undercroft is Ardenmoor's oldest wing, a long stone hall of racks and sealed crates and bound record volumes, lit by oil lamps because no torch is permitted near the older papers. Normally it was attended by the kingdom's 2 senior archivists. I had not thought about the undercroft in years, the way you do not think about the foundations of a house you live in. But during the investigation, Morthaes had ordered the archive unsealed. The council needed every territorial record from the past 40 years pulled and examined to build the procedural case. The sound I heard was a drawer rolling on its runners. Then footsteps, light, unhurried, and the soft knock of a book being set down on the wooden cataloging table. Someone was working below me. I stood at the small iron grate set into my floor, a ventilation channel, too narrow for anything larger than a cat, and I listened. It occurred to me, after a moment, that whoever was down there could probably hear the sound of my boots on the stone above them. I said quietly, "Who is there?" A pause, then, "Lyra, I'm the traveling archive healer. I was called in to tend the old binding paste on the pre-compact volumes. The damp has been getting into the lower racks, and the senior archivists asked for help before the council pulled the crates." I recognized the voice. Not the name, I had not known the name, but the flatness of it. The particular quality of someone who does not perform composure because composure is simply how they live. The woman from the back of the hall. "You were in the judgment chamber," I said. Another pause, longer. "I was." "You were not supposed to be." "No." I waited. She did not say anything else. Below me, I heard the quiet sound of her resuming work, the careful scrape of a brush, the thin rustle of a loose page being coaxed back into its binding. "What do you make of it?" I said. I did not know why I asked. I had not spoken to anyone in 5 days. "The binding paste," she said, "or the charges?" "Either." A longer silence. Then, "The binding paste is salvageable. I've seen worse." And she said nothing more about the charges. But she did not leave. And the next morning, when I stood at the grate and said nothing at all, I heard her already there, the same light footsteps, the same unhurried movements in the undercroft below, and I understood that she was going to keep coming back, and that she had decided something I was not yet privy to. I will tell you what I learned about Lyra in those days, piece by piece, the way you learn a landscape through a misted window, imprecisely at first, detail by detail, and then all at once. She was not from Ardenmoor. She was what the older pack customs called a waywalker healer, a wolf who had, years before, elected to belong to no single pack but to travel the circuit of mid-kingdom territories, tending to what each pack kept but rarely maintained, their archives, their wounded histories, the physical record of their agreements and their dead. It was a dying tradition. In my father's time there had been dozens of them. Now there were, as best I could tell, fewer than 10 left in all the mid-kingdoms. She carried no pack allegiance. She had no house, no standing, no lord to speak for her. She was useful to every pack in the circuit and invisible in all their social structures, the way the person who tends your walls is visible only when a wall falls. She moved through the world precisely because she did not belong to it. And this, I would come to understand, was both the thing that made her extraordinary and the thing that had allowed her to stay in the judgment hall that night when every other civilian had been quietly ushered out, because no one could quite account for her, and so no one had gotten around to asking her to go. She had been in the Ardenmoor undercroft for 6 days by the time the investigation began. She had been called in 2 weeks prior, at the archivist's request, to tend the lower racks. She had been sleeping in the small archivist's anteroom beside the undercroft, as traveling healers are entitled to do in any kingdom that has called for their service. She had been present, in other words, when someone brought the falsified record into the archive. I did not know this for several days. She did not tell me directly. This is one of the things you must understand about Lyra. She did not tell you things so much as she allowed you to understand them, the way a careful reader allows a text to reveal itself rather than forcing it to say what they already believe. She would make a comment, and I would sit with it, and 2 hours later I would realize I had been told something precisely and had simply needed the time to hear it. On the 8th day, she said, through the grate, the falsified record was delivered on the night of the 4th. I was sitting on the floor beside the grate by then. We had stopped pretending I was standing casually. I had a book open across my knees that I had not read a word of in 3 days. That was the night of the Northern Lord's Feast, I said. Yes. The Northern Lord's Feast was one of the council's formal events. I had attended. Every senior lord had attended. The archive undercroft had been unattended that evening from just before dusk until well past midnight, when the archivists had returned. I had known this, in the abstract way you know things about your own kingdom without quite seeing them, but I had not known until this moment that someone else had known it too. You were in the undercroft that night, I said. I was here, she said, yes. And the pause was long enough that I thought she was not going to answer. Then, I went to bed early. I was tired from the lower racks. I heard the door. She stopped. I waited. I heard footsteps, and I heard the sound of the third-tier drawer, the one with the territorial records. I know what it sounds like when it opens properly and what it sounds like when someone opens it who doesn't know the break. She paused. This person didn't know the break. You didn't come forward, I said. I didn't know what I'd heard, she said, until I read the charges. I thought about that for a very long time. And now, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp below me made a small sound against its glass, and I heard her adjust it. I'm still deciding, she said. It should have frustrated me. I was a king in chains, falsely accused, with my kingdom being reorganized around me while I sat in a room above a woman who was still deciding. There should have been anger in me, but there was not. There was, and I remember this precisely because I have thought about it many times since. There was the quality of attention that comes when something important is being considered with care, and you are in the room where it is happening, and you understand that the quality of the consideration matters more than the speed of it. My wolf, which had been silent for 8 days, stirred. Not a surge, a breath inward, like someone waking slowly. I said, "What are you deciding?" She said, "Whether what I know is enough to matter, and whether bringing it forward will help you, or only put the seal on the question of what I was doing in the undercroft that night and why I didn't say anything immediately." I understood her then, the position she was in. A woman of no pack, no house, no lord to vouch for her, coming forward to contradict the formal testimony of 6 named witnesses and a sealed record. There was no version of that in which she came out undamaged. If I were restored, there would be people who said she had been in my employ all along, that her testimony was paid for. If the council did not believe her, she would be removed from the circuit entirely. No pack would call a traveling healer who had inserted herself into a king's judgment proceeding. She was weighing the cost. Not to her comfort, to her usefulness, to the thing she had spent her life doing. I said, "I cannot ask you to do it." She said, "I know." And then neither of us spoke for a while, and I heard the sound of her working, careful, unhurried in the lamplight below me. On the 11th day, I woke before the light came in. The courtyard outside my window was sheeted in frost. I had been lying on the narrow bed watching the ceiling for an hour when I heard footsteps, Not in the undercroft below, but in the corridor outside my door, heavier than Lyra's. The guard's step, and then a second step I did not recognize. I heard the new counsel's herald read the notice aloud through the door. The investigation had proceeded. The evidence was considered sufficient. The succession conclave would begin in 3 days. A new Alpha of Ardenmoor would be named. I lay still and listened. The herald's footsteps retreated down the corridor. For a long time there was silence. Then below me I heard the sound of a drawer, the third-tier drawer with its stiff break, sliding open very quietly, and the sound of papers, and the sound of a lamp being lifted and moved, and then footsteps crossing the undercroft floor toward the stairs. She had made her decision. This is how it happened, as I was told later because I was not there. She walked into the council's morning session before the lords had settled. She was carrying a sealed crate, small, the size of 2 ledgers, and she set it on the presentation table at the front of the chamber without asking permission, and Lord Morthies turned from the window where he had been standing and said, with the tone of a man who is very controlled and very angry, "This is a closed session." She said, "I'm the traveling archive healer. I was called to tend the records. I have a record to present." One of the other lords said, "This session is not open for civilian testimony." She said, "I'm aware of that. But I believe what I have is relevant to the integrity of your evidence, which is my professional concern as an archivist, and if you close the session before I can present it, you will be doing so with the knowledge that you turned away archive testimony in an active succession proceeding, which is itself a violation of the compact." She paused. "I've read the compact, all of it. I've been in this undercroft for 3 weeks. She told me this part herself later. She said Morthies had looked at her for a long time and then he had said, "Present what you have," and she had opened the crate. Inside was the third-tier drawer's secondary ledger, the intake log, required under the compact to record every item added to the territorial archive with its date, time, and the signature of the duty archivist. The duty archivist on the night of the Northern Lord's Feast had signed out at dusk. The intake log showed the falsified record's arrival, timestamp, paper quality, drawer placement, at 3 hours past midnight. Unsigned. Added to the archive by someone who did not know the break on the third-tier drawer and had left a faint scuff on the rack from forcing it. She had also pulled the original paperwork from the Wolfholt Territorial Survey, conducted 7 years prior, which contained a survey map that contradicted the falsified annexation order at 4 boundary points. She said nothing beyond what the document said. She stood beside the presentation table while Morthies and the council read, and when a lord asked her what she had heard on the night of the 4th, she said it plainly, without embellishment, without performance. The witnesses were brought in, under direct questioning about the timeline. When exactly had they seen my courier, at what hour? Their accounts began to unravel. 3 of them had been at the Northern Feast themselves, and had noted my courier's departure early in the evening, before the undercroft had been opened. By mid-morning, Morthies had called a recess. By afternoon, 2 of the witnesses had recanted. By the time the sun cleared the western wall of the keep, Davin Morthies, who had served my father before he served me, who had read the charges in the great hall with an unreadable face, was kneeling in the judgment chamber, and the names of 2 junior lords he had worked with, who had wanted the Eastern Territory and had wanted a new alpha they could manage, were being written into the council's preceding records. I was not there for any of this. I was in my room in the Eastern Keep, listening to the silence and to the sound of the frost melting off the courtyard stones. My wolf, which had been quiet for 11 days, was awake and turning inside me, not loudly, not with any urgency, but with the particular quality of attention that means, "Pay attention to this. This is the one." The door to my room opened at mid-afternoon. A guard I recognized, not Morthies's, mine, the one who had stood outside my door since the first night, and had the sense to be ashamed of the orders he'd been given, came in and unclipped the chain from around my wrists and said, "My lord, the council is waiting." I will not pretend that the restoration was simple. These things are never simple. There was the reading of the finding, which took time. There was the formal stripping of Morthise's chain of office, which he accepted without speaking, with the face of a man who had calculated wrong and knew it, and was not going to make it worse by performing either remorse or defiance. There were the two junior lords, who were less composed, and whose composure I did not particularly care about. There was the full council, assembled in the hall where 11 days prior I had stood with chains on my wrists, and I stood now in the same place without them, and I watched every face in the room do the complicated work of people who have chosen wrong and must now choose again. I let them do it. It was at the back of the hall again, the back of the hall in the same spot in the same traveling healer's cloak, that I found her. She was not watching me this time. She was watching the council, with the same level, unhurried expression she had worn the first time, the expression of someone reading a text carefully to understand what it actually says rather than what she expects it to say. She had her kit bag on her shoulder. She had been, I realized, preparing to leave. The traveling healers do not stay. They are called, they serve, they go. I crossed the hall. She heard me coming. I am not a quiet man, and the hall had gone very still in the way halls do when a king moves through them, and people are not yet sure what the king is about to do, and she turned, and looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not composure, something under it. She was not certain what I was going to say. Good, neither was I entirely. I said, "You did not have to do that." She said, "The archive records were incomplete. It was my professional obligation to correct them." I said, "That is not why you did it." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "No." My wolf, which had been turning inside me all afternoon, was utterly still. Not the silence of the chains, not the silence of a door shut, but the silence of something that has arrived. The silence of a key finding a lock it has spent a very long time looking for. I knew what I was feeling. I had heard about it. Every alpha who takes a mate describes it differently: a flame, a pull, a sound, a scent. For me it was none of those things. It was simply the end of a particular kind of alone. The bone-deep recognition of someone I had not known I was looking for because I had stopped believing there was someone to find. I said, "Your name is Lyra." She said, "Yes." I said, "I know you don't stay." She looked at me carefully. "That's correct." "I'm not asking you to stay," I said. She waited. "I'm asking you to tell me," I said, "whether what you felt when you made that decision, when you decided to come forward, when you picked up the crate, was about the record, or about something else." A long pause, the kind she gave the things that mattered. She said, "Something else." My wolf breathed out. Not a roar, not a declaration. A long, slow exhale, like a creature that has been waiting for a very long time and has only now, only in this moment, permitted itself to rest. I said, "Then I would like to know what you want." She looked at me steadily. "That's not a question I'm accustomed to being asked." "I know," I said, "I'm asking it." She was quiet for what felt like a long time, but which was probably only the span of a few breaths. The hall around us had gone very still. The council, the guards, the lords who had turned their faces away 11 days ago and now could not quite bring themselves to look away again. She said, "I want to finish the lower racks. The damp has gotten into the pre-compact bindings, and if they're not treated properly, they'll deteriorate." I looked at her. She said, "And after that?" Another pause. "I don't know. I haven't thought past after that in a long time." "Would you be willing to think past it now?" I said. Something moved across her face then, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. The thing that happens in the features just before a smile, when the person is not yet certain the smile is warranted. She said, "That depends on what you're suggesting." I'm not suggesting anything, I said. I'm asking, there's a difference. Yes, she said after a moment, there is. I said, the bond is there. I expect you feel it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. I'm not asking you to accept it because of the bond, I said. The bond it's a fact, like the archive record. It doesn't oblige you to anything, but I stopped. I had governed for 19 years. I had addressed councils, passed judgments, spoken at the funerals of wolves who had died in my service. I was not accustomed to not knowing what words came next. I would like the chance, I said, to be known by you, and to know you, whatever that looks like. At whatever pace you're comfortable with. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, I've spent 17 years not belonging anywhere. I know. I don't know how to do it, she said. Neither do I said. I've been doing this alone for 19 years. I've forgotten what it's like not to be. She looked at me, really looked. The way she looked at the archive records, the way she had looked at the judgment chamber that night with her full attention and without flinching. And then she said very quietly, all right. Not yes to the bond, not yes to the lunatic, not yes to a ceremony or a claiming or anything else. All right to the beginning, all right to the chance. It was enough. I should tell you what happened to Morthies. He was stripped of his chain of office and his council seat. He was not imprisoned. The compact's provisions for a proven breach of council conduct specify removal and permanent exile from the judgment chamber, not imprisonment. And I held to the compact because the compact is what I had been accused of breaking, and it was important to me that it be seen to hold. His co-conspirators, the two junior lords, lost their Eastern Territory suits and were reduced in standing. One of them left Ardenmoor entirely. I did not mark their going. The 6 witnesses were dealt with separately. 3 of them had been coerced. Morthies had held debts over them, the kind of debts that are hard to contest when a man of his standing decides to call them in. I showed them what the compact prescribed for coerced testimony offered in good faith versus deliberate perjury, and I set their debts aside, and I told them that if they ever chose to do this again, chose it freely, without a hand at their backs, I would not be so measured. 2 of them wept. I did not need them to weep. I needed them to understand. 3 of the witnesses had been willing. Those 3 understood the law without needing my explanation. I say all of this not because it is the important part. It is not, but because I want you to understand that I am not a man who let these things go without consequence, and I am not a man who performed mercy to be seen performing it. I did what the compact required. And then I went back to the Eastern Keep, where Lyra was still working in the archive undercroft, tending the lower racks, and I sat at the grate in the floor and I said, "They've been dealt with." She said without looking up, "Good." And that was all. She stayed through the winter. I will not make more of it than it was in the beginning. She finished the lower racks, 3 weeks more, careful and methodical, the way she did everything. She treated 3 wolves in the keep who had accumulated small injuries nobody had gotten around to reporting. She reorganized the intake log system in a way that meant the kind of unauthorized addition Morthies' man had made would trigger an automatic discrepancy flag on the next quarterly audit. She did not move into the keep. She stayed in the archivist's anteroom, which she had made her own in small ways, a lamp placed at a particular angle, a folded extra blanket on the window seat, a stack of volumes she had pulled from the racks that she was reading in her off hours. When I visited the undercroft, which I did, increasingly in the early mornings when the keep was quiet, she was usually already at work, and she would not stop what she was doing when I arrived, but she would talk, slowly at first, then more freely. I learned things about her, the way you learn a landscape. She had been born to a mid-kingdom pack that had dissolved when she was 11. The Lord had made poor choices, and the pack had fractured, and the fragments had been absorbed by neighboring territories, and Lyra had been in the group that was absorbed and then, some years later, had looked at the absorbing pack and understood that she did not belong to it either. She had apprenticed with an old Waywalker healer who was finishing his last circuit, and when he retired she had taken up the circuit herself, and she had been walking it for 17 years. She did not tell me this as a sad story. She told it the way she told me about the binding paste, practically, as information. But I listened to what was underneath it. 17 years of waking up in whatever space was available, of being useful and then moving on, of building no roots because there was no ground that had ever offered to hold her. I thought about the bond. I thought about what it had felt like, not a flame, not a pull, but the end of a particular kind of alone. I thought about what it must have felt like from her side, to have carried that aloneness for 17 years and then to feel it shift. I asked her once in the undercroft in the early morning with the lamps going and the frost on the stones outside, "When did you know?" She set down the brush she was using. She thought about it, really thought, as she did with things that mattered. "The night of the chains," she said. "I knew I should leave. I knew there was no reason to stay that wasn't going to complicate things." A pause. And I looked at you and I thought, this man has not looked away from a single face in that room, even though every face is turning away from him. And I thought, I would like to know what a man like that is when the chains are off. I said, "And now that you know." She looked at me, the small smile, the precursor, "I'm still learning." "Yes," I said, "so am I." On the last day of winter, I asked the council to assemble. They came with the particular wariness of a council that has been wrong recently and is not yet certain of its footing. The new members, the remaining old ones, the lords of the 14 mid-territories who had turned their faces away in the hall and had spent the past months living with that knowledge. They assembled in the great hall in the full formal arrangement, and I took my chair, and I let the quiet sit for a moment before I spoke. I said, "In the matter of the Ardenmoor Luna." The hall was very still. I said, "The bond has come. I am aware that this will surprise most of you, since I imagine most of you had concluded it would not, and some of you had probably begun to calculate what would be done about a succession after a kingship without a Luna." I let that land for a moment. "The bond is present, and it has been present since the night of the autumn council, and I have taken the winter to be certain of it, and to give the woman concerned time to be certain of her own mind, which I consider the more important factor." I looked at the back of the hall. Lyra was there. She had known I was going to say this. I had told her the night before, carefully, exactly what I intended to say, and I had told her that nothing would proceed without her agreement and that her answer in the affirmative was not something I would assume. She had looked at me for a long moment and said, "I've been thinking about what you asked me, in the undercroft, what I want." I had waited. She had said, "I think I want to stop moving." I had said, "Ardenmoor has room." She had said quietly, "I know." Now she stood at the back of the hall, in the same traveling cloak, with the kit bag on her shoulder. She always kept it on her shoulder. I had come to understand that this was not carelessness, but a habit so deeply worn it had become part of her posture. And she was watching the council with the same level, unhurried attention she brought to everything. I said to the council, "I am naming her my Luna and my fated mate and the Lady of Ardenmoor. Her name is Lyra. She is a Waywalker archive healer, born to the Caro Pack, trained to the old circuit, and she has served every mid-kingdom territory with more integrity than most of you have managed in 19 years of sitting comfortable council seats." I paused. She saved this kingdom. She did it without a title, without a house, without a pack at her back, with nothing but a lamp and an intake log and the willingness to stand in a hall full of people who were not going to thank her for it. I looked at the faces, the ones that had turned away, the ones that were carefully neutral, the one or two that had the grace to look at their hands. You will show her the respect due a Luna of Ardenmoor. You will not ask where she came from in the tone that implies it matters. You will not require her to prove her worth to you. She proved it in the one moment that mattered, in a room that most of you were busy failing in. The hall was utterly still. I stood. I walked to the back of the hall, which I had done once before and which felt, now, entirely different, because now I knew her, and she knew me, and the bond between us was not a revelation but a settled thing, the way a healed joint aches less than the break did and eventually stops aching altogether, and what is left is simply the fact of being whole. I held out my hand. She looked at it, and then she looked at me, and the small smile came all the way, not the precursor, not the almost, but the actual, specific smile that I had learned over a winter was hers and nobody else's. And she reached up with her right hand and took the kit bag off her shoulder and held it out to one of the guards, and then she put her hand in mine. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, starting at the front and moving back through the rows in the way that things spread through a room when they cannot be stopped, the council stood. The lords, the guards, every wolf in the hall of Ardenmoor on their feet in silence, which is the oldest acknowledgment and the most honest one. My wolf, entirely at rest, exhaled. She still tends the lower racks. This is one of the things I love most about her, that she did not stop being what she is simply because of what she became. The Undercroft is hers now, properly staffed and lit, and with a system she designed herself that every archivist in the Mid-Kingdoms has since asked to copy. She trains young healers in the Waywalker tradition, and she has put it back on the circuit more formally than it has been in 40 years. And sometimes in the early mornings, when the keep is quiet, I come down and sit on the edge of the cataloging table and watch her work, and she talks to me in the unhurried way she has, about the records, about what the records say about who we've been, about what she thinks about the damp situation on the fourth rack. I do not think I can explain exactly what it is to be known. Not recognized, not claimed, not seen across a hall, but known. The way she knows the archive. Not because she decided what it contained before she read it, but because she sat with it and was patient with it and let it be what it was. She said to me once, in the Undercroft in the early morning, I spent 17 years moving so I wouldn't have to notice that I wasn't wanted anywhere. I said, and now? She was quiet for a moment, the good kind of quiet, the kind that means something is being considered with care. Now, she said, I notice that I'm staying. They ask me sometimes, the young lords, the ones who were not in the hall that night, what it was like, the chains, the 11 days, the investigation. They want the story of it, the shape of how a falsely accused king was restored. I tell them the facts, because the facts are worth telling. The intake log, the break on the drawer, the timeline that unraveled, the witnesses who could not hold their stories together under direct questioning. I tell them about Morthies, and about the compact, and about what happened to the 2 junior lords who had wanted a different Ardenmoor. What I do not tell them, because some things are not for councils and lord chambers and the formal proceedings of a kingdom, is what I think about when I think about those 11 days. I think about a woman standing at the back of a hall, with every other face turned away, looking at me without flinching. I think about a lamp below me in the Undercroft, going long after the rest of the keep was dark. I think about her saying, I'm still deciding. And I think about what it means that she decided, not because the bond compelled her, not because a king asked her to, but because she is Lyra, patient and precise and unflinching. And she read the situation the way she reads every text, not deciding what it said before she looked at it, but letting it show her what it was. And what it was, I think, was this: a man who needed someone to stay, and a woman who had never had anywhere to stay, and between them the oldest kind of knowledge, the kind that arrives not as a flame but as a door swinging open on a room you did not know was there, and finding it warm. She is my Luna. The Ardenmoor Council bows to her. The lords who turned away have, in the years since, learned to mean it when they bow. The Waywalker healers have a formal place in the kingdom structure now, which she lobbied for quietly and persistently, and without any drama whatsoever, and which I signed into the compact on a Tuesday morning while she stood at the window checking the light and did not make a fuss about it, because that is not who she is. And sometimes, in the evenings, she leaves the kit bag in the corner. Not always. Old habits have a life of their own, and I have never once asked her to put it down. It is hers. But sometimes she does. And every time she does, my wolf is still. Not the silence of the chains, not the silence of doors shut and faces turned away, but the silence of something complete. A key that has found its lock and does not need to search anymore. That is what I know about fate. It does not always arrive as a blaze. Sometimes it arrives as a woman at the back of a hall who does not look away. Sometimes it arrives as the sound of careful footsteps in a room below you, and a lamp that stays lit when all the others have gone dark, and a voice saying I'm still deciding, with the patience of someone who, when she decides, means it entirely. She decided. And I have spent every day since in the particular warmth of being known by someone who chose to know me.